chains go taut first. Not the swords, not the arrows. The chains. Thick iron links running from ship to ship, lashing hull to hull, until an entire battle line stops being a fleet and becomes something closer to a single, floating wall. It's the 24th of June, 1340, in the shallow estuary of the River Zwin, and you are standing on a deck that is not currently going anywhere. Nobody's deck is. That's the point. Above you, longbowmen are already loosing arrows in flat, ugly arcs into a mass of French, Genoese, and Castilian ships, packed so close together that missing one target only means hitting the next. Below you, men are hacking at grappling ropes with axes, trying to cut their own ship free before the boarding parties arrive. The English have arranged their ships with a specific logic to it, repeated across the fleet. A fast ship stuffed with knights and swordsmen, sandwiched between two slower ships, packed floor to rail with longbowmen. Whichever direction the fighting turns, that middle ship has cover fire on both sides. It's not an accident. It's a formation, worked out before a single arrow was loosed, the same way you draw up a battle line on solid ground. And somewhere in that chained, splintering mess is one particular vessel that the English fleet is fighting harder to reach than any other ship in the entire battle. Harder, even, than the flagship. Not because of who's on it, because of who used to own it. This is not a story about knights charging across a field. This is not a story about a siege tower creeping toward a castle wall. This is not a story about a king's crown changing hands in a single afternoon. This is a story about wooden castles at war on open water, cogs and galleys turned into floating fortresses, and about the one small ship that both England and France wanted back badly enough to bleed for it twice in 2 years. Hold on to that ship. We'll come back to her. Because the truth about medieval navies is stranger and considerably more organized than some guys with swords got on some boats. Over the next half hour, you're going to see 4 completely different ways medieval powers tried to solve the same brutal problem. How do you fight a war on water that belongs to nobody? And how one of those solutions ends with a poet standing in a shipyard, describing something that sounds uncomfortably like hell. Pull the camera back for a second, away from Sluys, and ask a much duller sounding question. What did a medieval kingdom actually have when someone said, the Navy? Here's what most people get wrong. They picture something like a modern fleet, just older, gray ships painted brown, permanently stationed, permanently ready. Neither England nor France had anything close to that in the middle of the 14th century. What they had was merchant shipping, cogs mostly, broad-bellied trading vessels built to haul wool and wine, not to fight. When a king needed a fleet, he didn't launch one, he borrowed one, ship by ship, from the same merchants who'd been using it to move cargo the week before, which meant those ships needed retrofitting, fast. Sometime around 1285, English cogs started getting temporary wooden platforms bolted onto the bow and stern before a campaign, crude, boxy structures that gave archers height over an enemy deck. By around 1350, shipwrights stopped bothering to take them off. The castle became part of the ship, literally a fortification, built onto a merchant vessel, because that merchant vessel was about to become a warship, whether it liked it or not. And this is where the record surprises you, if your image of sea battles comes from anywhere else in history. You're probably picturing ships ramming each other, ancient triremes with bronze beaks below the waterline, splitting hulls open, sending crews into the water. That's not what's happening at Sluys, and it's not what's happening anywhere in Europe by the 14th century. The ram itself had vanished from Mediterranean warfare no later than the 7th century AD, when the design knowledge behind the fast ancient trireme was simply lost. What replaced it wasn't a better ram. It was a spur, a solid, above-water projection built to snap an enemy's oars and give your own men a walkway onto his deck. Not a weapon for sinking ships, a weapon for boarding them. So strip away the Hollywood image entirely. A medieval sea battle wasn't 2 navies trying to sink each other. It was 2 armies trying to capture each other's ships, which means every question that mattered on land still mattered here. Who has the higher ground? Who has the better missile troops? Who can force the other side into a fight they can't win? The sea didn't change the rules of war. It just took away the ground to stand on, until someone built one out of timber. 4 kingdoms solved that problem 4 different ways. One negotiated for it. One legislated for it. One kept the recipe a state secret for 4 centuries. And one built an industrial shipyard so far ahead of its time that a poet mistook it for the entrance to hell. We're starting with the negotiation, because it might be the strangest deal any medieval king ever struck for military power. Here's the negotiation. 5 towns, 1 king, and a fleet built entirely out of tax law. Cinque, from the Old French for 5, gave its name to a confederation of English Channel ports: Sandwich, Dover, Hythe, New Romney, and Hastings, later joined by Winchelsea and Rye. In 1278, their arrangement with the crown was formally chartered, and the terms were exact, almost to the point of pettiness. 57 ships, 1,140 men, each ship crewed by 21 men and a boy, owed to the king, free of charge, for exactly 15 days a year. Sit with that number for a second, because it's doing more work than it looks like. 15 days. Not until the campaign's won. Not until the enemy's driven off. 15 days. And then, technically, those ships and sailors belonged back to their owners. Back to hauling wool and fish and wine across the channel. War or no war. If the king needed them longer, which he almost always did, he had to pay. And the crown's track record on paying its debts on time was, to put it gently, not good. Which means the single most important naval power in medieval England wasn't a fleet at all. It was a deal, a set of tax exemptions and trading privileges traded for ship time, negotiated town by town, year by year, with a monarch who usually owed money he didn't have. You want to know how thin England's wall of naval defense actually was in this period? It was thin enough that when King Edward finally scraped together the ships for Sluys, one contemporary account puts his entire available fleet, before requisitioning, at around 40 vessels. Everything else had to be borrowed, badgered, or bought at the last possible moment from merchants, who had every reason to be reluctant. And here's the part that stings. If you were one of those merchants, this wasn't charity. Losing your cog to royal service for 15 days, or 15 weeks, if the king was slow to let go, meant losing your livelihood for that stretch. It meant your ship might come back damaged, or not come back at all. The Cinque Ports weren't volunteering out of loyalty. They were accepting a business risk, in writing, because the alternative, refusing the crown outright, was worse. So when you picture the medieval English Navy, picture this instead: a filing cabinet of charters, a handful of coastal towns doing double duty as merchants and reluctant conscripts, and a king who, more than once, had to talk his way into borrowing back the very ships he was supposed to command by right. It worked, mostly. The naval historian Susan Rose, who spent a career on exactly this period, treats it as the direct institutional seed of what would eventually become the Royal Navy, not a design anyone chose on purpose, but an arrangement that outlasted every attempt to replace it, right up until the 15th century. If that surprised you as much as it surprised me the first time I read the actual charter numbers instead of the textbook summary, 57 ships, 21 men and a boy, 15 days, that's worth a like. It's a strange enough detail that it's exactly the kind of thing YouTube needs a signal to know people care about. So that's England. A navy built out of favors and 15-day contracts. But England wasn't even the strangest system out there, and we haven't gotten to the one with a state secret, the one with a law code, or the one with a shipyard a poet compared to hell. This channel exists for exactly this, pulling the real, documented system out from under the version everyone assumes is true. If pulling apart medieval navy into 4 completely different answers is useful to you, subscribing means you catch the next one before it's gone. Start with the law code. since that's the one written down in the plainest terms. In Norway, a fleet wasn't organized around ships. It was organized around land. The coast was divided into ship districts, skipreder, and each district owed the crown exactly one longship, fully crewed, fully provisioned, whenever the call went out. Not as a favor, as law. Codified in regional statutes like the Gulathing law, this system had a name, the Leiðangur, Leidang, in its modern spelling, and it worked less like a royal fleet and more like a tax bill that happened to come due in oars and timber instead of coin. And the ship that law demanded wasn't incidental to how any of this fought. Norse longships were clinker-built, their planks overlapping like shingles, powered by oar and a single square sail together, with a bow and stern shaped so nearly alike that a crew could reverse direction without ever turning the hull around. That shallow draft let them do something no continental navy could manage: row straight up a river or run a hull directly onto an open beach, troops ashore, and fighting before anyone inland even knew a fleet had arrived. It's exactly that combination: shallow water access plus a hull built to reverse on a dime that turned a raid on the monastery at Lindisfarne in 793 into the opening note of what the rest of Europe would spend the next 2 centuries calling the Viking Age. Here's what makes this different from what you just heard about England. This wasn't a negotiation between a cash-strapped king and reluctant merchants. It was compulsory, tied directly to how much land you held, written into law generations before anyone in Scandinavia would have called themselves a unified kingdom. Some historians argue the Leidang even selected its commanders by demonstrated skill in raiding and command, rather than by noble birth alone, though that particular claim rests on thinner evidence than the ship quota numbers themselves, so take it as a live debate rather than settled fact. What it produced, when fully called up, was genuinely enormous. When Harald Hardrada assembled his invasion fleet for England in 1066, estimates put it at somewhere between 250 and 300 ships, carrying 10 to 15,000 men, figures modern historians treat as reasonable estimates. Not a precise medieval headcount, but even the low end of that range is a fleet most of contemporary Europe couldn't have matched. Now here's a fact that's genuinely, not just textbook genuinely disputed. Historians are still working out exactly how old the Leidang system is. Some point to 10th century sagas crediting King Haakon the Good with inventing it. Others find evidence pushing it earlier still. If you've got a theory about why a levy system this important would be so poorly dated in the surviving record, the comments are open, because even the people who've spent careers on this haven't settled it. Which brings us to the system that ran on the opposite principle entirely. Instead of a law written for every landholder, a secret held by exactly one government. Byzantium's navy fought around a ship called the dromon, from the Greek for the runner, a bireme galley built for speed, roughly 100 oars split between 2 banks, 25 rowers to a side on each deck. What made the dromon genuinely frightening wasn't its speed though. It was mounted, at the bow, with a bronze siphon that could throw fire, a substance that burned on the surface of open water that regular flame fighting couldn't touch. The chronicler, Theophanes the Confessor, recorded its first major deployment in the year 678, when Emperor Constantine IV used it to break an Umayyad siege of Constantinople. The fleet that arrived to conquer the city instead retreated in flames. And this is where the record gets almost comically tight-lipped. The exact recipe for Greek fire was classified as a state secret by the Byzantine government, guarded for more than 4 centuries, and to this day, nobody has fully reconstructed what was actually in it. Emperor Leo the Wise laid out the doctrine himself, in a military manual called the Tactica, written around the turn of the 10th century. Don't waste the fire firing wildly at shielded men. Approach. Project it in controlled bursts. Let it do damage to hulls, rigging, and morale, and only then close the distance and board, once the enemy's capacity to fight back had already burned down to nothing. Which means even Byzantium, with a weapon literally nobody else on Earth possessed, still ended every battle the same way every other medieval navy did. Ships alongside each other, men crossing from one deck to the next. The fire wasn't a replacement for boarding, it was just the best possible setup for it. If the laydown was a law, and Byzantium was a secret, Venice's system was something closer to a machine, and it starts with a poet standing somewhere he never expected to end up. In 1314, Dante Alighieri arrived in Venice as an ambassador from Ravenna. He almost certainly walked through the gates of the arsenal, the state shipyard where the Republic built, armed and maintained its war fleet, and what he saw unsettled him enough to put it directly into the inferno. He describes vats of pitch kept boiling through the winter for recalking hulls, one worker patching a ship's ribs, another hammering at a bow, another twisting rope, another mending sail, an entire circle of specialized, ceaseless labor that reads, in his own poem, like a description of hell itself. That's not a metaphor added later by historians for effect. That's a working ambassador, in 1314, choosing a shipyard as his mental picture of eternal punishment. He was reacting to something real. From the 1320s, with the expansion known as the Arsenale Nuovo, Venice restructured shipbuilding into something no other power in Europe was doing. Separate stations for hulls, oars, rigging, sails, and weapons, with a half-finished galley towed from station to station instead of workers moving between jobs. They'd also shifted to frame-first construction for their new great galleys, building the skeleton before the planking, instead of the reverse, which used less timber and cut build times dramatically. This is, in the most literal sense, an assembly line, roughly 5 centuries before Henry Ford's. Now, the number you've probably heard, that the arsenal could turn out a fully armed galley in a single day, is real, but it needs a date attached to it. That figure belongs to the arsenal's peak, generally placed in the 16th century, around the era of Lepanto, when the workforce had grown to some 16,000 arsenalotti. One famous version of the story even has Venice launching a complete war galley during the time it took a visiting king to eat dinner in 1574, and historians studying that account generally conclude it was staged, components pre-built, and simply assembled for show, not built from raw timber in real time. So, the one-ship-a-day record is a later boast built on top of a genuinely medieval foundation, the organizational system Dante watched taking shape 2 centuries earlier. And while Venice was perfecting the art of building ships fast, something else was quietly changing what those ships would eventually carry. The earliest illustrations clearly showing guns mounted on ships date to 1326. By 1338, at the Battle of Arnemuiden, an English royal ship went into combat carrying 3 iron cannon and a handgun. The first recorded naval battle in Europe fought with shipboard artillery, small weapons, anti-personnel only, nowhere near capable of sinking a hull. But the age of pure grappling and boarding had just quietly acquired an expiration date. That ship's name was the Christopher. Remember her? She's the ship from the opening, the one both fleets fought over twice in 2 years. Gun-armed at Arnemuiden in 1338, captured by the French the following year, and at Sluys in 1340, the single heaviest fighting of the entire 9-hour battle wasn't over the flagship, or over either commander's own vessel. It was English soldiers fighting to take back one recently gunned, recently lost cog, because by 1340, a ship that could carry cannon wasn't just cargo anymore. It was a statement about what naval power was about to become. This isn't a coincidence. This isn't a footnote buried in a chronicle. This is the same ship, fought over for 2 completely different reasons 2 years apart. Once for what she carried, once for what she represented, and the record just happens to have kept her name. That's the kind of detail that's genuinely fun to bring up with someone who thinks they already know how medieval sea battles worked. So here's what the whole tour actually adds up to. First, there was never one thing called the medieval navy. There were at least 4: a negotiated deal, a legal levy, a state secret, and an industrial system, And every one of them solved the same problem in a completely different way, using whatever a kingdom actually had: land, law, secrecy, or labor. Second, and this is the part worth sitting with, naval power in this period tells you more about how a kingdom organized itself than about how many ships it owned. England's weakness wasn't a lack of ships. The Channel had plenty of those. It was the absence of any system to command them permanently. Venice's strength wasn't the galley design. It was the machine built to produce galleys on demand, year after year, without needing a genius to design a new one each time. Third, and this is the one that stays with you, is the Christopher. Fought over once for cannon, nobody had really figured out how to use yet, and fought over again a year later because by then, everyone understood exactly what she represented. Most ships in this story don't have names. She does, twice, for two different reasons. And that's not an accident of the record. That's the record telling you where the story actually turns. And it turns somewhere specific. The Cinque Ports' 15-day-a-year arrangement, cobbled together out of tax breaks and reluctant merchants, is the documented, direct institutional route of what eventually became the Royal Navy. Not a plan anyone drew up on purpose, an arrangement that simply outlasted every attempt to replace it. So here's the question worth sitting with. Out of all four systems, negotiation, law, secrecy, or machine, which one would your country have actually been capable of building? Be honest about it in the comments. Most people guess wrong about their own. Four systems, one ship that mattered twice, and a poet who walked into a shipyard and thought he'd found the entrance to hell. Because, for a few hundred years, he wasn't entirely wrong.